Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the new ARP homelessness funding, an overview and discussion of ED's July 6th announcement. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is Erin Patterson. I'm the Director of Education Initiatives at Schoolhouse Connection. And in just a few moments, I'll introduce my colleagues, Patricia Julianell and Allie-Ann Anderson. But first, I'll share a little bit about Schoolhouse Connection in case you're not familiar with us or you're joining us for the first time. Our mission is to overcome homelessness through education, and that's a recognition of the fact that the more education a person is able to attain, the less likely they are to experience or continue experiencing homelessness. We also recognize that schools are often the first place that children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness are seen, identified, and connected to services. And so we worked towards this mission in several ways through federal policy advocacy, state policy and practical assistance, and we also support a network of young scholars. For today's webinar, we're really thrilled to have an incredible lineup. We'll start in just a minute with comments from the U.S. Department of Education, and Levi Bohannon has graciously agreed to join us to share some information about this new announcement. We'll switch to Patricia and Allie-Ann after that to share an overview of ARP HCY funding and the additional federal funding sources that are available to support children and youth experiencing homelessness. Then we'll transition to hear how SEAs and LEAs are thinking about using these funds, and we're thrilled to be joined today by Donna Bolt from the Oregon Department of Education. And last, we'll end with your questions, discussion, and ideas for using these funds. I'll also share that throughout the webinar, we'll take breaks and pauses for your questions, and we encourage you to use the questions box. That's where we'll look to see what's on your mind, and we also encourage you to share any ideas you have. Maybe you've started rolling out your funding and ideas for how to use these funds, and we want to use this as an opportunity to share and to see each other in this work. Just a note at the top of today's conversation, we're going to do our best to answer your questions. I know there are lots of questions out there. Some of them we know the answers to, some of them we don't know the answers to, and so we ask for your patience, knowing that the Department of Education is in the process of also answering those questions and making sure you have the best information available. And also that you all come from states across the country who likely have unique considerations, and we hear a lot of stories about the process and how this is rolling out differently in each state. And so with those disclaimers, we will do our best to get to all of your questions and to answer all of them, but if we can't, please understand why. I'm going to turn it over now to Levi Bohannon with the Department of Education.
Thank you so much, Erin. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So hi, my name is Levi Bohannon. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. At the top, before I get started, I do want to thank the hosts at Schoolhouse for the invitation to join you today and for all of the incredible work that you do to support the field and support students experiencing homelessness. I also want to thank folks in the audience, not only for joining, but for all the work that you do as well. This topic and this issue is very important to the administration, but also to me personally, as I was a student who experienced homelessness myself. My hope today is that on behalf of the department, I can share a little bit of information on some of the funds made available to children and youth experiencing homelessness through the American Rescue Plan, particularly focusing on distribution and state plans. If we could cut to the next slide, that'd be great. In addition to a number of resources distributed by other federal agencies, the ARP included nearly $122 billion in resources for state and local education agencies through the ARP Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund that can be used to address student needs resulting from and exacerbated by the pandemic, including for students experiencing homelessness. In addition to that, the American Rescue Plan included $800 million to support the specific needs of children and youth experiencing homelessness. In April, the department released the first $200 million of the $800 million in ARP HCY funds to states for immediate disbursement. That disbursement of the remaining $600 million is ongoing following the receipt of state applications last week. If we could go to the next slide. Before I go any further, I have to do a shout out for the incredible program staff here at ED who have done a great job of making sure that all of the resources are available to the public in addition to making sure that the programs run smoothly. Here you'll see a screenshot of our ARP HCY program website. If you click on the link for ARP Homeless 2 Notice of Final Requirement on the ARP HCY website, which is the second bullet up from the bottom, it takes you to the Federal Register webpage for the notice. If you'd like to take a peek, feel free to click through. I'm going to skip over a little bit of ARP Homeless 1, which was the first disbursement. But if you're not so familiar with the initial disbursement, please feel free to access the documents that explain it on the website. So on the next slide, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the second distribution, or ARP HCY2, as we call it. The disbursement period is ongoing, and I'm happy to go into a few of the details on the distribution formula. Each SEA must award subgrants by allocating at least 75% of the funds it receives under ARP HCY2 to LEAs as follows: about half, or not about half percent, 50% in proportion to the amount that each LEA received under Title 1A for FY 2020 allocations, and 50% in proportion to the number of homeless children and youth identified by each LEA using the greater of the number of homeless children and youth in either the 2018, 2019, or the 2019-2020 school year. The department is requiring that either SY 2018, 2019, or SY 2019, 2020 homeless enrollment counts be used in this formula. For each LEA, a state must use a school year with the higher total account. Some states have assets if SY 2020, 2021 data can be used. It cannot. We wanted to accommodate SEAs and LEAs that may have undercounted during the pandemic by allowing homeless enrollment counts from the reporting year prior to the pandemic. We've verified that data by LEA, released them via Ed Data Express. So in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the requirements for receiving a subgrant, or as it's well known, the consortia requirement. In order to receive a subgrant on its own, an LEA must have an ARP HCY allocation of at least $5,000. If an LEA's allocation, based on the formula described in the previous slide, is less than $5,000, it must apply in consortium with one or more LEAs that raise the combined allocation to $5,000 or more. This could look a couple of different ways. An LEA could form or join a consortium with other LEAs with an allocation less than $5,000. An LEA may also form a consortium with an LEA whose allocation is already over $5,000. And the LEAs do not have to be contiguous. I'd like to highlight here that some of the work we may ask the help for in the field is the need to help LEAs below the threshold find another LEA with which to form a consortium in order to access the ARP HCY2 funding. If such LEAs are not adjacent, we want to make sure that there is a connection that is made. Alternatively, helping an LEA that is below the $5,000 threshold join a consortium with an adjacent LEA that is above a $5,000 threshold may be an easier way to form a consortium, as that larger LEA may have more experience administering homeless education funding, including the Title I Part A homeless set-aside. An SEA should establish a deadline in order to determine LEA allocations, and an SEA may require LEAs to submit an application. On the following slide, all states will need to submit a state plan for how it will implement the ARP HCY program, including funds from both ARP HCY1 and ARP HCY2. State plans for the ARP HCY program are due to the department within 60 days of the department's publication of the application, which would make the due date September 7th, 2021. Though, of course, I will note the department will accept completed state plans before the September 7th due date. Please note that there is no required format for the state plan and that we are not providing a template for the state plan. Additionally, the department will confirm receipt of the complete state plan received through its mailbox, which is listed here. Once the state plan is considered complete, the department will review the state plan. If needed, the department will follow up with SEAs to request revisions to the state plan. Please note that all state plans, once approved, will publicly be available on the department's website. On the next slide, I'll share briefly about what the content must be included on the state plans. All of this is publicly available, so I'll run through it very quickly. As outlined in the ARP HCY application, SEAs must respond to 8 prompts within the ARP HCY state plan, 3 having to do with ARP Homeless 1, 2 having to do with ARP HCY 2, and 3 prompts which refer to both disbursements. Please note that some prompts have multiple components, and SEAs must address each component of the prompt. On the following slide, I do want to make sure to encourage all states to make an explicit connection between the ARP HCY state plan and the ARP ESSER state plans that were due to add earlier this year. Ever since ESSER 1 was set up with the CARES Act funding from spring of 2020, the department has encouraged states to prioritize children and youth experiencing homelessness at the SEA and the LEA levels with these funds. And the Dear Colleague letter on the ARP HCY program indicates that the ARP HCY funds should be used in conjunction with the ARP ESSER funds rather than in place of the ARP ESSER funds. Therefore, ARP HCY state plans should discuss the coordination of funding with all 3 ESSER grants as appropriate. Before I wrap up, I want to leave you with some information on additional supports on the following slide. The National Center for Homeless Education, NCHE, in collaboration with the EHCY Program Office, hosts bi-weekly peer-to-peer state coordinator webinars focused on ARP HCY implementation. So far, we've covered everything from wraparound services to LEA uses of funds. We're hoping to cover additional topics moving forward, including transportation alternatives, ARP HCY monitoring, and more. Look forward to seeing you there, and I appreciate you joining. That wraps up the slides that I'm going to share. I look forward to listening in on the remainder of the conversation. And thank you again for inviting me to join.
Awesome. Levi, thank you so much. That was a great informational overview. I do want to elevate a couple questions that came into the chat that we've already answered. So check your chat box if you're able to be in front of your computer. One listener asked if you can access this PowerPoint, and the answer is yes. In your handouts pane of the control panel, you'll see a PDF version of this slide presentation. If you're not able to be in front of your computer, you'll automatically receive the slides as part of a follow-up email after today's webinar. I do want to keep us moving since we have a jam-packed conversation planned for today. And we wanted to shift now, in light of the information about ARP HCY2 funds, we wanted to shift and sort of help tie this all together and then remind you of some potential uses and some big picture ideas that we're excited about. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Patricia Julianell, who's going to share with us about ARP HCY1 and some reminders there. Patricia?
Thanks, Erin, and hi, everyone. It's nice to have so many of you with us here on this summer's day. We just wanted to, again, remind you that there are these 2 batches of funds, even though ARP HCY1 was made available to states back in April. Many local school districts have not seen these funds yet, and so we didn't want to create any confusion about, well, what comes first and what comes second, because there are some differences among these 2 batches of funds. So first thing, when will LEAs, those are again local educational agencies, school districts, charter schools, etc., when will they receive these funds? We don't know exactly because it's different from state to state. Some states have already dispersed that ARP HCY1 batch that came out in April. Some states have not dispersed those yet. So if you work for a school district and you haven't seen those funds, or if you're a community-based agency and you've been reaching out to your school district to try to find out if they've received them, they may not have received those yet. They may come out later this fall in a number of areas. There is no deadline for when these funds have to reach local communities. There's not a specific date on them. So I know that states are trying to get them out as quickly as they can, but there's no specific deadline. For the second batch of funds that Levi was just talking about, again, those really just went out to states very, very recently. So I'm sure no local educational agencies have received those yet, but you could look for those coming out probably early fall. So ironically, some LEAs may get the ARP HCY2 before they get the ARP HCY1, and that's fine. I'm sure everyone will be using the funds as soon as they can. In terms of some other differences between these 2 batches of funding, the first batch of funds has to be dispersed to local educational agencies through some kind of a competitive process, and this is one of the reasons why this is taking a bit longer in some states than others. So local educational agencies must apply for these funds. They have to provide some basic information so that a grant application can be graded and reviewed at the state level, and then those funds will be provided. So maybe not all LEAs are going to be eligible for those funds. Different states will establish their own rules for that. Some states are only giving those HCY1 funds to school districts that already have a McKinney-Vento grant. So there won't be any new charter schools or school districts getting those funds. Others may be opening it up more broadly. So again, that can vary state to state. The ARP HCY2 funds, though, are totally different, and Levi just explained how those are actually going out by a formula and also can go out through consortia. So we do expect that many, many more LEAs will be getting that second batch of funds than those that were able to receive the first batch. And I think I get to turn it over to Alianne now. Take it away, Alianne.
Thank you, Patricia. Hello, everyone. Okay, so we know that we have these funds and we have some idea of how much we're going to get, but how can we use these funds? So ARP HCY funds are able to be used to satisfy any expenses that are reasonable and necessary to facilitate the identification, enrollment, retention, and general educational success of children and youth experiencing homelessness. And I want everyone to take a note of the general flexibility within this specified use. In addition to this flexibility, of course, they're going to be able to be used to, for any of the 16 purposes and already authorized uses of EHCY. They're also going to be able to be used to connect students and families to summer learning and enrichment programs this summer and engage students and help prepare them for the fall, because we know that so many students are dealing with, what we call learning loss or unfinished learning right now. So this is a very critical use as well. But in addition to these academically related uses, they're also able to be used to provide wraparound services, which do include academic supports as well, but it also includes providing trauma-informed care, mental health services, and socio-emotional support for our students. They're also able to be used to purchase needed supplies such as PPE, school supplies, personal care items, even eyeglasses. They're also able, next slide please. They're also able to be used for transportation purposes as well. They're I'm so sorry. They're also able to be used to provide cell phones for students and families, providing short-term temporary housing, which, for example, can be a few days stay in a motel, but it is to be noted that this is in last resort cases. And of course, they're also able to be used to increase liaison and McKinney-Vento program general capacity. So that's hiring on new staff, in case you're wondering if they will be able to be used to hire new staff as well. In some cases, we've heard of persons even hiring unaccompanied homeless youth to help identify these students as well. So these are just some ways that these funds can be used. Next slide, please. So in addition to general uses by LEAs, LEAs and SEAs are also encouraged to award contracts to community-based organizations that they've identified in their communities that are well positioned to help in identifying children and youth experiencing homelessness, especially those who are in historically underserved populations, such as children and youth in rural areas, children and youth who belong to tribal groups, students of color, children and youth with disabilities, English learners, LGBTQ+ youth, and pregnant, parenting, or caregiving students, and help to connect these students as well, of course, to the academic supports and wraparound supports that they need as well to succeed in school. Next slide, please. Actually, I know everyone, it does delay a little bit sometimes, so yeah. And yeah, okay, so in terms of like how to use these funds in the most strategic way and ensure that we're maximizing these funds, ARP HCY funds, we're encouraging everyone to use these funds to meet urgent needs, of course, but not to replace funds that are otherwise available. And we'll talk a little bit about these more in the next slide. And this is another important point that is not only encouraged by the Department of Ed, but it's actually something that's included, that's explicitly stated in previous guidance, that ARP HCY funds are to be used to supplement supports that are provided within ESSER funds and not replace these funds. So they're supposed to be used in conjunction. And if anything, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon too, but we encourage everyone to even refer to these funds first before digging into the ARP HCY funds. And as I mentioned a little bit, there are so many other funds, there's so many other pots of funds that are available, which we'll get to in the next slide. that we encourage LEAs to and SEAs to also dip into as well to meet some of the urgent needs. And just to pull out a couple of these, so in terms of like technology and connectivity needs, there's the E-rate program, which provides funding to support schools and libraries in purchasing laptops, tablets, etc., to increase student access to technology for use outside of school. All schools and children are eligible to benefit from the E-rate program. It is to be noted, however, that it is more likely that schools with higher concentrations of low-income families and also schools who are in like rural areas, they may be prioritized, but once again, it's something that everyone is eligible to take advantage of. Continuing connectivity, there's also the emergency broadband benefit, which is more specific to households. So what this benefit does, it's another source of increasing connectivity or access to connectivity for these students, but rather than for schools, it's aimed at the households, and it provides up to $50 in reimbursements for households, and in tribal areas up to $75. And it also comes with the offer of an up to $100 discount on the purchasing of laptops. And eligible households include households where at least one of the family members is a beneficiary of the free and reduced school lunch program. If there's at least one member of the household who has received a Pell Grant within that current award year, they're also eligible to take advantage of this benefit. Some other things just to highlight, there's the Earned Income Tax Credit, which was actually expanded within the American Rescue Plan Act to unaccompanied homeless youth and foster youth who are 18 years old and full-time students. As previously, full-time students had to be at least 24 to be eligible to receive the EITC, but for 1 year under the American Rescue Plan Act, so this is up until 2022, unaccompanied homeless youth and foster youth who are once they reach at least 18, they'll be eligible to receive the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Child Tax Credit has also been expanded within the American Rescue Plan Act up to $3,600 for families where children are 6 years and under, and $3,000 for children who are between the ages of 6 and 17. So these are just some other, these are just a couple of them. And of course, we see that there are quite a few listed here. I'll pop in the chat box right after this a link to our navigation tool, which has more information on how families can access these fundings, the period of availability, etc. Like all the information that you need to know is in this document. So I'm gonna share that with you all so you can get some more information about the remaining available parts of funding. Next slide, please. So I know that, of course, like there were quite a few, and it might be a little overwhelming because like trying to figure out like which one of these fundings to go to first. So we encourage everyone to consider first, what are the needs of McKinney-Vento children and youth in your community? And we also encourage persons to go out and solicit stakeholder feedback to try to get an even better understanding of the specific needs. So this is maybe even going to providers, shelters, etc., just finding out like what are the most urgent needs to be addressed. Then we encourage persons to use the most restrictive funding sources first, followed by the more flexible uses of funds, just to ensure that when we have the flexibility, we're maximizing everything. So an example of this is turning to Title I funds first, as they're a little bit more restrictive in terms of how they can be used to address students experiencing homelessness and their needs. Then turning to McKinney-Vento subgrant funds before finally looking towards the ARP HCY funds. And then finally, we of course encourage persons to think big, because this is unprecedented funding, not just in terms of the overall amount, but also in terms of the flexibility and the ways that it can be used. So we encourage persons to think of the innovative ways for how these funds can be used, how they can be used to support the students. And we're going to hear a little bit more later on, just a sneak peek of how the state of Oregon is using this and thinking big, but I don't want to get too ahead of everything, but just to tease everyone. And then I think I'm turning it over to Erin.
You are correct. Allian, thank you so much. Thank you all in our audience for your questions. I want to encourage you to keep submitting those in the questions pane. We will take a pause in just a moment to get to those, and Patricia's been answering some of them, but there are some that we wanted to be sure and elevate in the conversation so that we can all hear and think through those together. Just like Allian left off with, we encourage folks to think big about these funds. And she laid out some really great ideas of how to think about using these funds strategically in terms of sequencing with other sources of education funding, making sure you're thinking about other federal funding streams that are available that might be able to help support children and youth experiencing homelessness. And so we wanted to highlight just a few ideas that we're excited about and that we hope you'll be excited about too in terms of using these funds. The first thing I have to say is transportation, transportation, transportation. I see a number of questions rolling in the questions box about transportation related expenses and how funds can be used for transportation. I think that's a really exciting opportunity. And we're hearing people think big. We know that transportation is a large expense during normal times for school districts. I've heard upwards of tens of thousands of dollars being used to transport children and youth to their school of origin. And so we're encouraging folks to think big about transportation, whether that's adding more bus drivers, adding more bus routes, more buses, or even purchasing a fleet of vehicles that that McKinney-Vento families would have access to and can literally be in the driver's seat of their own mobility. The other thing I'll elevate is a continued need for outreach and identification of families and youth experiencing homelessness. This is, as you all know, an ongoing need, but these funds can really be used to maximize the resources you have available, including additional staff members, additional ways of communication, just a plethora of ways to use these funds for that. And given that Allian just walked us through all the various funding streams available that you could potentially use and access for children and youth experiencing homelessness, we're hearing some exciting ideas from states and districts about using these funds to hire systems navigators, someone whose job it is to identify additional needs outside of the educational space and make sure that families can help navigate those needs and make sure that they have access to those different systems within your communities. And then the last one I'll highlight here is don't forget about the early childhood space. We're hearing some states already starting to think about hiring a specific early childhood homelessness navigator whose job it would be not just to identify and reach out to families in the early childhood space, but then to make sure that those children experiencing homelessness are transitioned and can be given a warm handoff into the K-12 system. So we're going to pause as promised and get to your questions. And I've been keeping an eye on some of these coming in, but I'm going to maybe suggest to my colleagues, Patricia and Julianelle, that maybe can we start with the transportation related questions? I've seen a few of those come in, and then we will get to the other questions as time allows. And Patricia, I don't know if you want to start us off. I've seen some questions come in about what's allowable for transportation, if there's a maximum amount. So I'll turn it over to you to start to address that.
Yeah, there have been quite a few questions on that. Thank you all for your questions. Please keep typing them in. I've been answering them as quickly as I can, but lots are coming in, which is good to see. In terms of transportation, generally speaking, there are some principles around paying for transportation that are in the McKinney-Vento Act that do apply for the ARP HCY funds. So even though the uses for ARP HCY funds are broader than what you could typically use McKinney-Vento funds for, there are some principles that still apply, and one of those is excess cost. So in the McKinney-Vento Act, it's specific that McKinney-Vento funds can be used to cover excess costs of transportation. So what does that mean? It means if you consider what your district or your charter school already is offering to all students, you want to offer that, of course, to your McKinney-Vento students, and you don't want to use ARP funds or McKinney-Vento funds to pay for that. You're going to use your regular district funds or perhaps IDEA funds or whatever you're using for other students to pay for that. So the bus going back and forth to the local school, if you have activity bus or other things that all students are able to access, then your McKinney-Vento students need to be able to access those transportation services. What you can use ARP and McKinney-Vento funds for are those excess costs. So that might be any kind of transportation that you don't typically provide. Like Aaron was saying, that might be transportation to preschool opportunities. It might be transportation to extracurricular activities. Absolutely might be transportation to the school of origin, because you're not typically busing students across district lines or even across state lines or attendance area lines to get back and forth to school. So you can use these funds for anything that is considered to be an excess cost, which is just above and beyond what you provide for other students. That was one question that came in. There was also a question about purchasing vans, insurance, drivers. I'm happy to answer that, or I can kick that over to either Aaron or Allianne. I know this is something we've discussed internally, and we know what our answer is on that, if anyone wants to jump in. Everyone's being shy. I can say what it is. The answer is yes. Again, these are excess costs because you're providing some kind of specialized transportation to students experiencing homelessness. You're going to a place where there isn't a bus route, or you're using these vans to provide transportation while you set up a bus route. There's usually, a several-day lag between the time you can reroute a bus, let's say, to pick up a McKinney-Vento student. You can't just have that student sitting at home for those days, so maybe you have a van to provide that transportation over that time, or maybe you use the van for your preschool students, get your young children back and forth to those preschool programs or Head Start programs. So yes, you can purchase a vehicle, and you can pay for what is required to operate that vehicle as well, which probably is going to be a driver, insurance. Someone asked, I think, if you could have an attendant on the bus. An attendant might be something that, might be covered by IDEA if that's related to a disability. So I guess I would say maybe case by case on that one, because again, we want to use these funds for excess costs.
Thanks, Patricia. I'm going to also add that there's just a clarification here from our friend Melinda. Thank you so much, Melinda, for that clarification that there are certain restrictions and considerations regarding the allowability of a purchase of vans, and your SEA will have a process and an approval for those types of purchases. So thank you, Melinda, for that reminder. I want to shift us to another topic here. We're getting so many questions in. Some questions are about the position of a systems navigator, and wondering if there's anyone out there who could share a potential position description that you're putting out there. So I do want to encourage our participants and our audience, if you do have any examples of that to share, please do. I'll put in a plug here that Patricia did a great webinar with some folks in Memphis who have a Navigator program that might be of interest. That webinar is archived on our website. But Allianne and Patricia, if there's anything else you want to say about a systems navigator, please jump in here. I'll also add that from my early childhood hat, this could be a potential game changer for children and families experiencing homelessness. We know that Head Start has family service positions. But the issues for families experiencing homelessness are vast and go beyond the early childhood program, whether that's Head Start, childcare, or state pre-K. And so this could be a potential opportunity that when a family comes into your early childhood program who is experiencing homelessness, you can not only connect their child or children to an educational program, but also help the family navigate X, Y, and Z, whether that's the need for job training, the need to apply for medical insurance, whatever their needs are. This systems navigator would have a relationship with other agencies in your community and be able to sort of Sherpa them through that process and make sure that all of their needs are met. Allianne and Patricia, anything else that you want to add on the topic of a navigator?
I'll just put in a plug for our Facebook group. I put a link in the chat for that. That's a great place to ask for sample forms, share documents, crowdsource solutions. I actually asked for a systems navigator job description on our Facebook group a few weeks ago, and I got one. So I can share that out, but also that's just a great place to go for that kind of information.
Awesome. In the interest of time, I'm looking at our clock, and I want to pause here, but I want to encourage our audience to continue submitting questions, because we will come back to your questions in just a few moments. But I want to be sure that we can hear from one of your colleagues, and we're really thrilled to be joined today by Donna Bolt. Many of you know Donna from her role in the Oregon Department of Education, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Patricia and Donna to have a conversation here about how SEAs may use these funds.
Thanks, Erin, and hello, Donna. Donna is possibly the first state coordinator I ever met many, many years ago. We won't talk about how many years ago that was, but we're very happy to have you here today. We really wanted to talk about some of these bold and big picture innovative ideas. I think probably everyone on the call, certainly every one of us on the screen, is still struggling a little bit with what's allowable, what's not allowable. This is all very new. I know the Department of Education is still kind of formulating some of its kind of lines between the gray areas and what's truly allowable. So we're all kind of working through this together, but I knew that you would be a person who has been thinking big and thinking very strategically about this, and so I wanted people to have the opportunity to hear from you. So I have my questions that I have prepared for you, and my first question is, tell us about some particularly or interesting examples that you've heard from LEAs in your state for using ARP HCY funds, whether that's the first batch or the second batch.
Well, as I was listening to my the previous speakers, you were ticking off some of the ideas that I was going to share with you. And so, you know, one of the first ones was think big. And, you know, I remember reviewing mckinney-vento grant applications in the past where people thought big, and yet it wasn't the right time. The funding didn't really allow for that broad of a reach, like a purchase of a van. How many liaisons have I heard say, man, if I only had a van, I could just go and pick up these kids over here, take them to the doctor's appointment over there, and also do this errand and that thing. And, you know, it's too hard to get the other district vehicles to do these things. And if I only had, and this is an opportunity to do that. If, again, your state allows it, if your district allows that, you want to talk to your transportation folks and make sure that everything's kosher with them, make sure that the liaison or whoever's driving has the right driver's license. But this is the opportunity to think big like that. Also in Oregon, you know, in addition to the pandemic, and like a lot of states in the West here, we've had wildfires and entire school districts have been leveled overnight. And the same thing is happening again this year. And so the dislocation of families and households and youth is huge. And so we've got two things going on at the same time, and the need for those outreach workers and the system navigators is just crucial. So even though this money is just a one-time thing and short-term, it does extend for a couple of years, and there's the opportunity to have these extra staff people. I know from looking at the data that we're just getting in now for the last school year, there is a huge drop in the numbers of the kids that were identified. And I know that's not because homelessness is being solved here. No, it's because kids were not identified. They left. We know that there were a lot of students, both mckinney-vento and otherwise, who just walked away from distance learning and just weren't able to incorporate that in with everything else that was happening. So to me, you know, we used to talk about attendance incentive, you know, attendance incentives like the McDonald's coupons and stuff. Now we're talking about real, you know, back to school, you've left school, we want you back in, return to school incentives. These have got to be big things. You know, your McDonald's coupons are not going to do it necessarily. So talking to high school age students who may have stopped attending, you know, about graduation, you know, what would incentivize you to return? What about a college scholarship, a small one, you know, like the $2,000 range that some of our national organizations get. Now, you know, you want to check that out with attorneys and stuff, but looking at incentives for participation in school, for attendance, for returning to school, you know, what kind of creative things can we come up with? And then it goes to asking kids what it is that will compel them to come into school, to attend regularly. And that's where, you know, the whole idea of youth action boards that we have with the youth demonstration project grants, those youth action boards are really a dynamic piece that communities can use to help inform where to spend these dollars. And so part of the way to incentivize youth, you pay them stipends to participate on youth action boards. Now these are set up in a lot of communities through your continuum of care, perhaps might have a youth action board. I know our state is extending these. We're going to have a statewide advisory board as well as regional ones, and so participating in that where that's happening can incentivize youth and get them on board. And then taking that another step, what about parent and guardian action boards and incentivizing parents to help determine what it is that compels them to get their kids to school, and what it is that they need to make it easier to overcome the barriers and the obstacles to school attendance right now. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. Anyway, just basically everything that we've been doing before, but on steroids. Anyway.
I really like what you're.
Probably I went all over the place on that one, so probably take care of those last two.
No, I mean, you know how I feel about youth involvement and parent leadership, and with all of the challenges right now around identification, knowing that numbers are down, how are we going to identify students, how are we going to re-engage them? I think looking at how can we provide stipends to youth to ask them those questions and get their expertise, and even involve them, like Alianne mentioned, in helping to do some of that outreach and identification. It seems like kind of a win-win-win there. I did, so you're right, you did kind of answer a couple of my questions all at once there, but I did want to specifically ask you the last one because this is really important. I don't want us to skip it. Have you seen any LEA plans or anything that you all are talking about at the state level to use ARP HCY specifically to reach the historically underserved populations that we know tend to be disproportionately experiencing homeless, but often not really being reached, not being served appropriately, not being served adequately? So what's happening in Oregon to reach those populations?
So we have educational service districts here. A lot of states do something similar to that, where a lot of districts, like a county of districts, are under one sort of regional education agency that does some organizing and stuff. So in our frontier counties and the desert counties and some of the more sparsely populated rural areas and wilderness areas, we're organizing some of the state activities funds to help those agencies get their districts together and provide liaison training and maybe centralize some of the liaison duties and the transportation and the support. And unfortunately, a lot of our rural areas are also the wildfire impacted areas. And so we're just flooding those districts as much as we can with funding and assistance for dislocated families and unaccompanied youth who are often moving several districts away to find temporary housing while their homes are being rebuilt in those rural areas. And so so that's one thing we're doing in trying to get the funds out to the rural areas especially. And we've got things in the works to incorporate the tribes and some other groups, and are really excited then also with the youth advisory boards and stuff to compel some of the other groups in.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'll bet that we have some questions for you in the chat box. So I'm going to turn it back over to Erin to take us to our next stage here in the presentation.
Yeah, Donna, thank you so much. And thank you, Patricia, for guiding us through that conversation. It's so valuable to hear how you are navigating this process in real time. And Donna, I know that you mentioned coordinated entry, and we did get a question in that I want to put back out there and see if you have additional things to share on that front. The question is how you're partnering with other HUD-related programs, including coordinated entry and assessments being done in the homeless provider world in order to assist young people and families to get housed to be able to get to school. So anything you want to add about that coordinated entry and HUD piece?
We're just beginning to start working with different efforts. One county in particular has expressed interest in developing education programs or links between the school districts and the housing authority programs in that one county, but we're not very far into it. We've got a really strong partnership with our runaway and homeless youth coordinator at Department of Human Services, and that's how we're starting to navigate some of this, and they're very much linked in with housing agency, and so baby steps here, unfortunately.
I hear you on the baby steps piece. We are still getting some questions in about transportation, and before we shift away from Donna completely, I'm wondering if she can share anything about any Eureka transportation moments in Oregon, considering that Oregon has a large rural population, and any challenges you've seen there, and any hopes for using these funds to mitigate those transportation challenges.
Yeah, transportation is always the big hairy problem. And with the lack of drivers, bus drivers, I think that's not just confined to our state. I think that's all over the place. It makes it really hard. And so we are hoping that some of these funds can be used to leverage some support there. As a largely rural state, we don't have a lot of public transportation options, especially between communities. And so all I can say is creativity is welcome, but we're also, constrained like a lot of states are with regulations from the transportation side and safety side. And so we can't just say, okay, we're going to make Uber available to all, or, start promoting that everybody has Lyft contracts, because they don't necessarily jive with the regulations for school transportation that we're obligated to follow. And so making that close connection and asking transportation for their ideas, I think is really important, because maybe they've got solutions that we haven't thought of yet. And ideas are welcome. Thank you.
Yes, I totally hear you. We also subscribe to the ideas are welcome mantra. And I want to elevate a question here, Donna, and I'm reading through it in real time. It says, can Donna expand on how these funds can be used for families that are dislocated due to fires or other circumstances? Since funds cannot typically be used for housing, how will this work? And there's some additional context there, but I'm wondering, Donna, if you are experiencing that in real time and have any advice to share, and then maybe I'll open it up to Patricia and Allieanne as well.
So with the liaisons in these districts, at the first of last year, when we had our first round of large wildfires that displaced so many people, it was around Labor Day last school year. And liaisons spent a lot of time just trying to locate where families went. If they didn't check in necessarily, and then there were just like this tons of new families that were all of a sudden eligible, and it was a real difficult time. You don't want to like jump in and say, hey, you're homeless and here you can have all of these services. You had to be really careful and use the language appropriately, and just a matter of finding folks, making sure that they had access to distance learning and the meals and everything else that they needed as they tried to find their life back together again and put things into place. And then there was this period where people had gathered their trailers, and the ones that were able to find a place to stay, perhaps it was in a town where there was just this one group of trailers where everybody sort of huddled together in what was remaining of the town. And then so we've got liaisons bringing services to them, and sometimes the families would find places to live with relatives and stuff a few districts away. And so we're doing the school of origin thing. But all at the same time, it was distance learning. And so it was kind of ironically easier to do because everybody was remote anyway. And so it was easier to do School of Origin when you were already doing online learning. And so in that way, you know, just making sure that everybody's connected, that they've got the broadband stuff and, you know, putting the connectivity onto the buses sometimes so you have your hotspot that's mobile and all that kind of stuff. And those are the kinds of things that liaisons were doing to try to get families connected. And now with the continuation of this, we find that a lot of families, a lot of students haven't really come back to school. You know, they left and they haven't found it yet to come back. And so getting in with them and talking about what are the options. You know, there's GED, there's work-related school, you know, there's CTE stuff that we can do. Just finding ways to compel people to come back into school, and the incentives, whatever they may be, are there. So hopefully that's helpful in some way.
It's incredibly helpful. And just listening to you speak, Donna, I'm reminded of just the really heroic efforts that liaisons and coordinators do on the ground and navigating those unique circumstances across all of our states. And we really cannot thank you enough for the job that you do and for being willing to talk with us today and share these ideas. I'm going to go back to our questions pane. And I'm going to go back to transportation, and then I promise to pull some other questions into the mix. And Patricia, I'm going to try and generalize this question and maybe go to you to address this. It's a really valid question. Our audience member says, we will inevitably get this question from our school leaders. If I purchase a van for my homeless students and it's not in use, can it be used for others? And also, a van has a long life. How long would it have to be exclusively for homeless students? And so I'm wondering if I could turn it to you to talk about that specific question, and then maybe some other general transportation uses specifically for homeless students.
Sure. I think a couple of things come into play here. First of all, you know, we don't have exact answers to these kinds of questions. For some of this, I think it was Melinda who raised the point of talk to your state coordinator about this, talk to your local business office, you know, find out what is done for other programs when they buy vans. You know, how long are they used exclusively for that program? For the life of the van? What if it's not being used? A couple of things that I can say is there was a question in the questions pane about kind of the spending window for these funds. And I've been hearing a lot of people say, oh, we have to spend these by September, or we have to spend these by June 30th of next year. And I'm not sure exactly where those messages are coming from, if those are some kind of state or local requirements that are being perhaps erroneously put in place. But at the federal level, and this is on our website, and it's also in the Department of Ed's guidance very specifically, the window to obligate and draw down these funds is through 2025. So we do have a period of time to use the funds. In terms of exclusivity, one analogy that I can share is we did get specific guidance from the Department of Education several years ago around special education transportation. And if there is, let's say, a bus that's being paid by IDEA funds, the driver is being paid by IDEA funds, it is for transportation for special education students, but that bus might be going right by the house of a McKinney-Vento student who isn't a special education student, but you know, there's an empty seat on the bus. Can that student just hop on and use the bus? And Department of Ed very clearly said yes. As long as there aren't any excess costs, if the bus has to make a little detour to pick up that student, then you want McKinney-Vento funds to pick up those excess costs. But there's no problem in sort of multi-purposing transportation across programs, as long as the funds are being faithfully used for the program that it's dedicated for. So that leads me to believe that you could use a McKinney-Vento van for other purposes, as long as any excess costs involved are being appropriately funded. But that's definitely one where I'd probably say, you know, give your state office a call and try to get into those kind of real nitty-gritty details.
Awesome, thank you. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of interest in the Navigator Position job description, and so we've gotten two sources for that. One is our Facebook group. And if you're having trouble finding it, you can search that Facebook group and type in Navigator or job description, whatever gets you to that post. We also had an audience member submit a similar position through AmeriCorps, and I'm seeing that folks are having trouble locating that website. Maybe the link is broken, so we'll do our best on the back end to follow up about that and make sure that we can get that link out to folks. But I'm glad to see there's so much interest. We've received a few questions that I want to go back to about the department's formula for ARP HCY2 allocations and the difference between 1819, 1920 numbers. And so without going back to Levi's slides, I'm going to go back to our overview and invite Patricia or Allianne to share. I think the question was specifically who gets to choose and how is the school year chosen? Can they choose the school year with the largest number of identified students? And so I want to open it up for your responses to how that will work.
It's my understanding that they would use, that they can use, each LEA can use their largest count. Now I don't, run formulas and I'm not a mathematician, but presumably every state office has a department that runs formulas for them for all their different grant programs, and hopefully they'll be able to figure out how to run it for the state. But I know the intention behind the flexibility was to recognize, like Donna was saying, that in a lot of places numbers are down. That doesn't mean homelessness is down. That doesn't mean there are fewer children and youth experiencing homelessness. It means we actually need more funds and more effort to do more outreach to find them and provide them with services. So the Department of Ed didn't want districts to be penalized if they had had a very robust identification program and had lots of students, but then with the switch to distance learning, kind of lost them.
Thank you for that. We're also getting a couple questions about the difference between ESSER and ARP HCY funds, and I want to take a moment just to clarify some things there. The ESSER funds are primarily for K-12 relief uses coming out of the pandemic, and so while using those funds to support children and youth experiencing homelessness is an allowable use, and we certainly have encouraged states to include that population in their plans, it's not the primary use. For ARP HCY, those funds are specifically targeted for children and students experiencing homelessness. And so just like you heard Levi allude to, just like you heard Allianne talk about in the strategic uses section of our slides, the ARP HCY funds are to be supplemental to other funding sources. And so that's just a few things to put out there as you, as an SCA or LEA, are considering how to use these different funding streams. We're encouraging LEAs in particular to make sure you go through your other funding sources before you get to ARP HCY 1 and 2, because they are truly meant to be supplemental. And I think what we're hearing is that there's a lot of money to be spent there. And so those funds can be used for these very big ideas, not just to put more money into the same band-aids of solutions that we've been restricted to, but to really think about how to reinvent the way that we're supporting children and youth experiencing homelessness. I'll open it up to Allianne and Patricia if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, so actually going back to one of our earlier questions related to how to accommodate students who are dislocated, speaking of other funding pots, I want to suggest for persons to also look into options such as emergency housing choice vouchers, which do include mckinney-vento populations within the eligibility. They're classified under the at-risk of homelessness category, but they are listed in the American Rescue Plan Act as being eligible to receive these fundings, this fund, so that they're able to find housing. There's also the homelessness assistance programs, which are provided through the Home Investment Partnerships Program rather than typical rather than ESG, which we saw in previous COVID relief packages. So with ARP, the American Rescue Plan Act, it's gone through the Home Investment Partnership Program, and you can find out more about this and help connect families to find out their eligibility for homeless assistance. Because under this, once again, at-risk families are, which are, mckinney-vento families, of course, are eligible for this as well. But you can connect them to their to your local PHA, your public housing authority, and you can find this once again in the Navigator document that we have, which is in the chat. You can find links to like how to locate your local PHA and find out a little bit more information about how families, the other options for emergency housing in case. Because of course, like we mentioned that under ARP HCY, it is for last resort. And I also did see a question of someone asking to define last resort. And so in the Department of Ed's guidance, last resort is defined as being when it's the only reasonable option to provide COVID-related temporary housing for these families, and being the only way that these students can access school.
Erin and Aliane, I just want to throw in, if anybody's head is spinning a little bit, because Aliane knows all these programs so well, and I definitely don't. I hear Aliane talking about it, and I'm like, wait, what housing program? What did she just say? I think this really speaks to the importance of perhaps schools using some of their ARP HCY funds to hire staff who can navigate all these systems and make sure that families and youth that schools are serving are able to access all of these different programs and acronyms that Aliane was talking about, because there's so much out there right now. And if we don't have advocates out front advocating for our families and youth, they're going to miss out. They're not going to get the support. And it, you know, we may never have this much housing support again. You know, who knows?
All great points. Thank you both so much for that. We have just a little under 15 minutes left. I'm so glad we extended this webinar to 3:15 instead of just an hour long, because your questions are still coming in. And I want to elevate this question: do LEAs have to be in the same district when they are forming a consortium? And I believe the short answer is no, that we heard from the department that LEAs don't even have to be geographically contiguous. They just have to meet the minimum requirements in terms of the threshold of funding that they would be allocated. But I think that Patricia or Aliane could explain that much better than I did.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Aliane.
Okay, I just want to say, like, for example, like other like different types of consortium that persons can form is like schools that have the highest concentrations of students experiencing homelessness can form each other, even if they're not in the same geographic location. But if they just have like other different commonalities, then there's no, I don't believe there's just any real restriction.
No, there isn't. Nope.
Thank you. I'm seeing a couple sort of scenarios and situations come in, questions about, I think that to generalize, we hear a lot of questions about families in particular who are doubled up and so therefore meet the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness, but then do not meet the threshold in other agencies or systems for assistance. Pandemic EBT cards are the example here, but we hear about that a lot in the housing space as well as other agencies. And so I'm wondering if Patricia, Aliane, or even we'll invite Donna back in, if you have thoughts to share on how in the education space we can help those families navigate those different systems and apply for the aid that they need, including through hiring a systems navigator.
I mean, I think that's the best idea. I was actually just trying to look up that pandemic EBT information because that does seem strange. And I was talking with a school district recently, actually, a school district where everyone gets free meals. They're on what's called community eligibility. And they said that, you know, everyone was getting pandemic EBT, even when their income was way over what the limit should have been. So I don't know if there's some differences in the way different states are administering it, but I know that there are some resources out there. So I'm going to do some Googling around while you're looking at the questions.
So I don't have all the answers for pandemic EBT specifically, but this is just another way that you can help to help these families access food. The seamless summer option is actually expanded to all children, whether they're actually enrolled in school or not. Every single child who's like under 18 years old is eligible to receive free meals, completely free, under the seamless summer option. So if you have like a local SSO or seamless summer option provider like in your community, that's somewhere that you can direct families to as well. This is just something to add while Patricia does her Googles.
I'm sorry, I forgot I was on mute. I'm gonna vamp a little bit and turn to another question. And if Patricia's able to dig up some information, we'll turn back to her. But I'll also put in a plug that we have an actual great Q&A from our inboxes section of our website. And if you submit questions there, we do read them and we do respond to them. And then we post those on our website. And it's a great feature. It's usually Patricia who is doing the responding. And you can actually search through our Q&A as well on our website. There's a little search icon. And so if you have a question and you think others have experienced it, go ahead and give that a try on our website, and we'll try and address this one there as well. I noticed a question here that I really love. It says, with a focus on equity issues, might these funds be utilized for language acquisition classes or professional development? And I'm so grateful that you all are thinking about equity and how we can use these funds in that regard. I will say on the professional development side, I really encourage LEAs in particular to utilize these funds for professional development, specifically to make sure that every single adult in every single school knows the definition of McKinney-Vento, is able to identify the signs of homelessness that a student in their classroom might be exhibiting, and knows what to do if they suspect a young person is experiencing homelessness. We also encourage professionals in early childhood spaces to offer similar training and alongside their K-12 partners. That can go a long way in helping those children transition to the K-12 system. On the topic of language, I'm not sure about language acquisition classes in this context, but I will say, I'll use this as an opportunity to say that when we're talking about outreach and identification, we hear that families need information in their native language if they are not English speakers. And so we encourage folks to use these resources, this funding, to review all of your enrollment materials, anything that might inform a family about McKinney-Vento and what it is, and to revise it, to translate it into any possible language that any families might be speaking in your area. That can be a really powerful use of these funds. And I'll stop there and see if Patricia or Aliane has anything else to add on that.
I was also going to ask you to highlight this question, Erin, so I'm glad you did, because I think, you know, as we've emphasized throughout this whole presentation, you know, ARP HCY is supposed to be kind of the sprinkles on top. So there should be a language acquisition program, you know, English language learner Title III program available for students in your district. However, there might be lots of barriers that prevent a McKinney-Vento student from accessing that program. So if you want to provide them with transportation, if you want to provide them with some additional tutoring, if you want to provide mentorship, if you want to make sure that your professional development is very specific about what are some of the specific challenges around identifying families who might be immigrants or who might not be native speakers. We know that there's all kinds of issues of fear of deportation and legal consequences, and so people are really afraid to talk about their situations. So I think there are lots of ways in which it's really important that that LEAs and states are looking at the particular issues that are affecting non-native English speakers and making sure that that's baked into everything, whether it's identification, outreach, academic support, transportation, whatever else is being provided. So I think it's a great question.
Awesome, thank you. I'm seeing another question come in, and this is a really great clarification. I appreciate all these questions coming in. Back to the issue of consortium, consortiums, whatever the plural is there that we're using. Please clarify, can LEAs that receive more than the $5,000 minimum also choose to form a consortium, or is it restricted only to LEAs receiving less than 5K? And I'm going to look to Patricia and Aliane to check my understanding on this.
I want to say no, it's not restricted to LEAs that are only receiving less than $5,000. Like there are LEAs who may, their allocation is less than $5,000, but they can absolutely partner with LEAs whose allocations are much higher than $5,000. It's pretty broad in terms of like who they can collaborate with in that sense.
Patricia's nodding her head.
Yeah,
So
little brother can jump on with big sister there. It doesn't have to be two little siblings. There can be a big sibling and a little sibling together.
I like that analogy. And again, I'll just remind you all that this webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording along with a link to the slides, and the follow-up email will also post it as an archived webinar on our website. And we're also planning to share your questions with the department as they continue to develop their FAQs, and don't forget they're working in partnership with NCHE to produce some webinars in the coming weeks about some specific topics. one of which is transportation, and Patricia just answered another transportation question in our questions box about paying mileage. And just to elevate this into the conversation, the audience member says we currently pay mileage to parents to transport students to school. Could these funds be used for that? And the very long legal answer is yes. So that was an easy one. We want to encourage you to continue posing your questions in the questions box. This has been a really rich conversation today. I'll also just put it out there that if Donna has any thoughts on anything that's been raised from her perspective at the SEA, please do feel free to jump back in. And I'm gonna scroll through our questions in real time and see what we might have skipped over or what we need to go back to here.
Let me throw out one thing real quick, Erin, just because there were some questions about those ESSER funds, and I know you addressed it. For those of you who work in Title I districts, or you're familiar with the idea of the Title I set aside for students experiencing homelessness, I think that's kind of a good analogy for ESSER. Because obviously we want to make sure that those funds are supporting students experiencing homelessness, and there actually is a required ESSER set aside as well at the local level. I believe it's 20% if I'm remembering right. So it's even a number, which the Title I set aside is not a specific number. This one has a percentage on it, and it is specifically to serve student groups who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and students experiencing homelessness are specifically listed there as a group. So it would be interesting to find out how much is the set aside at your local level, and what is it being used for? And if it's not being used to support students experiencing homelessness, why not? And how you can access some of those funds, even if the uses aren't quite as broad as the ARP HCY funds. Again, they're pretty broad.
And just to add on to that, there's a similar set aside at the SEA level as well. It's 5%, where at the LEA it's 20%. But once again, these funds are definitely required. It's a requirement within ESSER for these funds to be used to support these disproportionately impacted student groups.
Really great reminders. Thank you both for that. I want to put one more question out into the ether for my colleagues. I noticed that on this webinar and in previous webinars that we've done and in our inboxes, we often get questions about how ARP HCY funds can be used for short-term housing options like a night or two at a motel. And I'm wondering if you can elevate anything that's in the guidance that compares to typical McKinney-Vento uses and anything to share on that front.
In terms of how it compares to typical mckinney-vento uses, I know that I don't believe that this is the regular eligible use of mckinney-vento funds, but like I mentioned a little bit earlier, they are able to be used, but in the last resort options, when all other options are exhausted and it's seemingly the only reasonable option that the LEA can provide for these families. Like there's no other way for these students to, there's no other way for you to get a roof over their head in order for them to get to school safely or to be close enough to school in those cases.
I agree. I have heard from at least one or two districts about, where there really is no other option and they can put a family in a motel for a night or two or a student. And that would actually get them eligibility. That would make them eligible for some different programs that might be available. However, we know that the HUD funding that came through the American Rescue Plan Act, at least, is students who are doubled up in motels. Any of the students that you're serving under the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness are going to be eligible for those HUD funds anyway. So they shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to just put them in a hotel just for the purpose of getting them eligibility for another program. But I don't know, maybe that works somewhere.
Definitely something to consider as well. And just one quick question that I saw, which you can get like a quick answer. I think someone asked how long the emergency broadband benefit lasts. So it's supposed to last for either 6 months after the Department of Health and Human Services has declared the pandemic to be officially over, or when the funds have just been completely exhausted, whichever one of those comes first. So if the funds aren't completely exhausted before the pandemic is officially declared to be over, 6 months after that, after this declaration. I'm so sorry, I confused myself, I think. I'm so sorry if I confused everyone else. But it's either when these funds are completely exhausted or 6 months after the declaration of the end of the pandemic, basically.
Awesome. That's so great, Ellie. And I'm glad that you knew that. I saw that question and was thinking we might have to follow up, but I forgot that you know everything when it comes to our federal funding sources. So that's perfect. In our last minute, I want to put in a plug. If you love having these conversations and thinking outside of the box and thinking big, then we encourage you to come to our conference next year in Austin, Texas, March 7th through 8th. We are designing this conference specifically so that teams can come, so that we can start to have some conversations about breaking down silos. And so there's more information on our website, schoolhouseconnection.org/ELH2022. It is our Education Leads Home Conference, first of its kind, and we're very excited. And knock on wood, we'll all be able to be together in person in March in Austin. I want to say thank you again to Levi Bohannon at the Department of Education, to Donna Bolt, the Oregon Department of Education, to my colleagues and co-presenters, Patricia Julianell and Allie-Ann Anderson. You will receive these slides, the recording, and all of the wonderful links that we've included. And we cannot thank you enough for all you're doing to support children and youth experiencing homelessness, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.